The line is in Latin, 4 words. Patton wrote them on a single sheet, late, in a requisitioned villa in Bad Tölz, in the autumn of 1945, and he did not translate them. He did not need to. Any cadet who had gone through West Point with a serious reading list would have known the words, though not from a Roman. They are not Roman at all. That is the first strange thing about this story, and we will come back to it. Eadem mutata resurgo. He had been removed from the Third Army 9 days before, not relieved in disgrace, not court-martialed, not arrested, reassigned, given the 15th Army, a paper command, an outfit that existed mostly to write the official history of the war it had not fought. The men who built the order chose their words carefully. It was a promotion in the way a man is promoted out of a room. Patton understood exactly what it was. He had spent his whole life understanding exactly what things were. He sat with the transcript of his own press conference in front of him and the relief order beside it, and at some point in that long evening, he wrote 4 words in a dead language, and he went to bed. I have seen a photostat of that sheet. The handwriting in the first 3 words is even. The 4th word, resurgo, is pressed harder, the downstroke of the G dug in. A man who knew Patton's hand would call it emphasis. I read it as 1. The 4 words were not for Eisenhower and not for the press. They were an answer to a dead man, a Roman general named Belisarius, who had walked through the same kind of door 14 centuries before and bowed. Now the second window. Constantinople, the year 548 or thereabouts. The chronology of the late campaigns is not clean, and the honest course is to admit that wherever it matters. A man stood outside the doors of the imperial palace and waited to be called in. He had reconquered North Africa from the Vandals in a single season. He had taken Rome back for the empire that had lost it. He had broken the Persians in the east and the Goths in the west. And he had done it, more than once, with an army the court refused to pay, and reinforcements the court refused to send. His name was Belisarius. He was the most successful general the Eastern Roman Empire would produce in 300 years, and the emperor he served, Justinian, could not decide whether to crown him or destroy him. So Justinian did the third thing. The thing courts always do to men who have grown too large. He recalled him. He brought him home from the front, gave him honors that cost nothing, and took away the only thing that had ever mattered to him, which was the command of armies in the field. Belisarius walked through those palace doors, a private citizen with a title. The procession that should have been a triumph was a quiet dinner. The sources are not unanimous on the exact sequence. Procopius, who served close to these campaigns, tells it one way in his public history, and another way entirely in the bitter secret book he wrote later. But the core of it is not in dispute. The empire's greatest soldier was taken off the board by the master he had served, and he let it happen, and he said almost nothing. 2 men, 14 centuries apart, the same kind of door, the same quiet on the other side of it. Patton did not invent this parallel for our benefit. He had read Belisarius as a boy, the romantic 19th century version, the blind beggar on the steps, which we will get to, and which is mostly wrong, and which he believed anyway. The figure of the great commander, discarded by the state he had saved, was not a comparison Patton reached for in 1945. It was a story he had carried in him since he was 12 years old. He simply, finally, walked into it. Let me put both men in front of you plainly, because the parallel only works if you see what each of them actually was. Belisarius was not a Roman in the way the word usually lands. He was born around the year 500 in a border province, a provincial soldier with no great family behind him. He rose on ability alone, which in that court was less a virtue than a liability. A man who owes his position to no faction belongs to no faction and can be cut loose by anyone. He married a woman named Antonina, older than him, sharp, connected at the highest level to the Empress Theodora. That marriage was the rope he climbed, and in the end, part of the noose. He won battles that should not have been winnable. At Dara, against a Persian army that outnumbered him 2-1, he dug a system of trenches and angles that funneled the enemy charge into killing ground. And the geometry of that field, in the reconstructions that survive, is the geometry of a man who thought in shapes.
Patton thought in shapes too.
Hold that. George Patton, by the autumn of 1945, was 60 years old and had nothing left to conquer. The war in Europe was 5 months dead. He had driven the Third Army across France faster than any army had moved in modern history, relieved Bastogne by wheeling 90 degrees in the dead of winter, crossed the Rhine, and made a point of it. And then the war ended, and a soldier built entirely for war found himself the military governor of Bavaria, administering a defeated country, surrounded by clerks and policy, and the kind of political question he had no instinct for and no patience with. He was a weapon in a time of peace. Both of these men were. That is the first thing they share, before anything either of them ever said.
If stories like this one,
soldiers reading the lives of soldiers across 2,000 years and recognizing themselves, are the reason you came to this channel, the small button below this video is what keeps them coming. That is all I will ask, and I will not ask it again. Here is the first hard fact that ties the two together, and it is documented, not inferred. Patton kept a diary his entire adult life. The main body of it sits in the Library of Congress. The published version, edited by Martin Blumenson as the Patton Papers, is where most of what follows can be checked. In it, across decades, Patton returns again and again to a small set of dead commanders. Caesar, whom he read in Latin, Hannibal, whose ground he walked in Sicily and Italy, Scipio, on whose hill at Carthage he stood in 1943 and said, in front of his staff, that he had been there before, and Belisarius, the forgotten one, the one whose story is not a victory, but an aftermath.
it is the aftermath that drew him.
A boy reads about Caesar and wants the crossing of the Rubicon. A 60-year-old general, just told that the war is over, and so is he, reads about Belisarius and understands something the boy could not have. That the dangerous part of a great soldier's life is not the war. It is the morning after the last war, when the state that needed him decides what to do with a man it can no longer point at anything. Patton had memorized things his whole life. Latin tags, passages of Caesar, the entire arc of campaigns 14 centuries gone. He carried a line in him for 40 years before he wrote it down on that sheet in bad totes. The line was not from Belisarius. It was not even Roman. That was the warning at the start, and it was meant as one because the place that line actually comes from is the strangest hinge in this entire story, and it changes what the 4 words mean. But that comes later. That is the third part of this. For now, hold the 2 doors.
In Constantinople,
A general who had given the empire back its lost half walks in to be thanked and quietly ended, and bows and accepts it. In Bavaria, 1400 years on, another general sits with the paper that ends him and does not bow, and reaches instead for a language nobody around him can read. What each man did on the far side of that door, the one who submitted and the one who would not, is what this story is about. The question that ended Patton's career was about Nazis, and it was asked in a tent full of reporters who already had their story before he opened his mouth. It was the 22nd of September, 1945. The press wanted to know why so many former Nazi Party members were still holding administrative posts in his zone of occupation. Patton was tired. He was contemptuous of the question, and he answered it the way he answered everything: fast, blunt, and without a single thought for how it would read in a newspaper the next morning. He said, in essence, that running a defeated country required men who knew how to run things, that you could not simply remove every functionary who had carried a party card. And then he reached for a comparison that detonated. The Nazi business, he said, was a good deal like a Democrat and Republican election fight at home. The exact wording varies between the accounts, and the transcript is not perfectly clean. It never is with Patton, who hated being quoted because he was always quotable. But the comparison was made. It went out on the wires, and within a week, the most successful field commander the United States had in Europe was being measured for a paper army. Eisenhower called him in. The two men had known each other for 25 years. They had been junior officers together, theorists of tank warfare together, friends in the long, flat years between the wars, when neither of them was anyone in particular. Now one of them sat behind the desk that ran the European theatre, and the other stood in front of it, and the friendship was a thing they both had to put down on the floor before they could speak. What was said in that room is not fully recorded. Patton's diary gives his side, which is not the same as the truth, and Eisenhower's later account gives another. The diary version and the staff version differ, and where they differ, neither one settles it. The result is not in dispute. Patton was to give up the Third Army, the instrument he had built, the men he had bled across a continent, and take the 15th, which had no front, no enemy, and no future. He went back to Bad Tölz, and he did not write the 4 words that night. Not yet. First, he wrote the rage out. Page after page, the diary entry running long, the hand getting worse as it went. He wrote that he had been betrayed by small men. He wrote that the war he had fought for was being lost in the peace. Some of it is the self-pity of a proud man, wounded in the only place he could be wounded. Some of it is clear-eyed and cold. The cold parts are the ones that have aged into something close to prophecy, and the self-pitying parts are the ones his defenders wish he had burned. He was both men in that entry. Most men are. Now go back. Constantinople, 14 centuries earlier, and a court that had perfected the art of destroying its own best servants long before Patton's grandfather's grandfather was born. Belisarius had given Justinian the impossible. The reconquest of the West had been a dream nobody serious entertained. The Western Empire was gone, had been gone for 2 generations. North Africa was Vandal and Italy was Gothic, and that was simply the shape of the world. Belisarius changed the shape of the world. He took Carthage and the African provinces with a force so small that the plan, on paper, was lunacy. He landed in Italy and took Rome itself, and then held it through a siege of more than a year, with a garrison that should not have survived a month. Procopius, who was there, describes the defense in detail, and the detail is the geometry again. The walls divided into sectors, the sorties timed, the man thinking in shapes under a pressure that breaks ordinary commanders. and his reward, across 2 decades, was suspicion. Justinian never gave him enough men, never sent the pay on time, twice recalled him at the edge of total victory because a victorious Belisarius frightened the palace more than a defeated enemy did. The Empress Theodora watched his wife, and his wife watched him, and the whole apparatus of the court treated the empire's salvation as a problem to be managed. When the plague came through Constantinople in the early 540s, and rumors flew that the emperor might die, certain officers were said to have discussed who should succeed, and Belisarius's name came up, not because he sought it, but because in a crisis, people look at the man who wins. That was enough. That was always enough. Justinian recovered and remembered. So here is the moment of decision for the Roman, and it is a quiet one, which is what makes it terrible. Belisarius was stripped of his command more than once across those years, and at the end, in his old age, his fortune was confiscated as well, and the men who had followed him were dispersed, and he was left in the city as a private man with a glittering, empty rank. And he did nothing. He had, at various points, the loyalty of soldiers and the love of the people of Rome, and the kind of reputation that in that century was a standing invitation to revolt. Other men with a tenth of his standing had marched on capitals. He had spent his whole life inside the logic of service to the state, and the state turned on him, and he held to the logic anyway. He bowed. He accepted the empty title. He let them take the only thing he was. Whether this was loyalty or exhaustion or the simple recognition that the alternative was civil war, and he would not be the man who lit it, the sources do not agree, and the man himself left us nothing. He submitted. That is all that can be said for certain. He submitted, and he was right to, and it cost him everything that comes after. Now the parallel scene, and watch how it bends. Patton, told the same kind of thing by the same kind of power, did not submit. Not in the way Belisarius did. He took the 15th Army. He obeyed the order. He was a soldier, and the order was lawful, and he did not refuse it. But he would not be silent, and silence was the actual price he was being asked to pay. The press conference had been the crime. The cure they wanted was for Patton to disappear quietly into the history-writing command and stop saying things into microphones. And Patton, even then, even removed, kept talking. To his diary, to his wife Beatrice, in letters that say more than the diary does. To the few staff officers still around him, one of whom later wrote that the general in those weeks was like a sword somebody had hung on a wall, still sharp, still beautiful, and serving no purpose anyone would name. 2 men, 1400 years apart. Same kind of summons, same kind of room. One bowed his head and lived inside the silence for the rest of his days. The other refused the silence and reached, in the privacy of a requisitioned villa, for 4 words in a language the men who had removed him could not read, which is its own kind of bowing and its own kind of refusal at the same time. There is one more thing about Belisarius that Patton carried, and it is the thing the boy had read at 12 and never let go of. It is not in the reliable sources. It is in the romance that grew up around him 1,000 years after he died. The story that the empire did not merely retire Belisarius, that in the end it blinded him and turned him out, and that the greatest general of his age spent his last days on the steps of a public building in Constantinople, sightless, holding out a wooden bowl, while the city he had twice saved walked past and dropped coins, or did not. That story is almost certainly false. The historians are nearly unanimous on this, and have been for a long time. Patton believed it his whole life. Why he believed it, why a man that intelligent held to a legend that the scholarship had already dismantled, is the hinge of the last part of this. Because the blind beggar was never really about Belisarius. It was about what Patton was afraid of. And the 4 words he wrote in Bad Tolts were his answer to that fear, 14 centuries in the making, and they did not come from any Roman at all. The line is carved on a tomb in Basel, not Rome, not Constantinople, a church in Switzerland, the Münster, where the mathematician Jacob Bernoulli was buried in 1705. Bernoulli spent much of his life studying a single curve, the logarithmic spiral, the shape a shell makes, the shape a galaxy makes, the shape water makes going down a drain. Its strange property is that it can be transformed in many ways and remain, fundamentally, itself. Cut it, scale it, reflect it, and the new curve is the same curve. Bernoulli loved this so much that he asked for the spiral to be carved on his grave with a motto beneath it: Eadem mutata resurgo. The same, changed, I rise again. Through an engraver's error, the stonemason cut the wrong spiral. The wrong shape sits over the right words to this day. There is something in that worth sitting with, but it is not the point. The point is the words, and the point is that an American cavalryman carried a Swiss mathematician's epitaph in his head for 40 years and pulled it out on the night his army was taken from him. How did it get there? The honest answer is that we do not entirely know. The motto traveled. It became a touchstone for a certain kind of man, engineers, soldiers, people who liked the idea that you could be broken and reshaped and come back the same essential thing. Patton read enormously and unsystematically his whole life. He could have met the line in 100 places. What matters is not the route. What matters is that of all the lines available to a furious, defeated, 60-year-old general, and he knew thousands in 3 languages, this is the one he reached for. Not a war cry, not Caesar, not vengeance. A geometer's quiet claim that the shape survives the transformation. Belisarius thought in shapes. That was the thing to hold, 3 parts ago. The trenches at Dara, the sectored walls of Rome. A mind that solved problems by finding the underlying form and bending the situation onto it. Patton thought in shapes too. The 90-degree wheel to Bastogne is a shape. The double envelopment he ran in France, the one he had studied in Polybius at West Point, is a shape. Hannibal's shape, the closing crescent at Cannae. And here at the end, removed, sidelined, a weapon hung on a wall, Patton reaches not for a sword and not for a Senate speech, but for the one motto in the Western tradition that is literally about a shape that cannot be destroyed by being changed. That is the cold speech of this story. There is no room, and no condemned man, and no enemy across a desk. The truth Patton spoke at the end, he spoke to a sheet of paper, in a language nobody around him could read, and it was not addressed to Eisenhower, or to the press, or to the men who had measured him for a paper command. It was addressed to Belisarius. It was the answer the 12-year-old boy had been carrying since he first read about the blind beggar on the steps. And the answer was, not me. You bowed, and they erased you, and the legend made you a sightless old man with a bowl. And whether that is true or not, it is not. The fear of it is real, and I refuse it. Eadem mutata resurgo. take the army, take the title, take the war itself away. The shape comes back. The shape always comes back. He was wrong about the legend and right about the fear. Belisarius was not blinded. He was not a beggar. The historians settled that long ago. The begging blind general is a medieval invention, beautiful and false, and it tells us more about what later ages feared than about what the 6th century did. What the 6th century actually did was quieter and worse. Belisarius lived on in Constantinople, restored to nominal honor in his last years, and died in his bed in 565. A private man, his victories already being folded into the glory of the emperor who had distrusted him. Justinian died a few months after him. The reconquered West began slipping away almost at once. Italy, ruined by the very wars that had reclaimed it. Africa, restless. The whole vast achievement starting to dissolve before the man who achieved it was cold. He rose again in no sense the motto would recognize. He simply ended. Patton ended faster. 3 months after the night in Bad Tölz, on the 9th of December, 1945, his car was struck by a truck on a road outside Mannheim. He was the only one seriously hurt. His neck was broken. He lived 12 days, paralyzed, lucid, making grim jokes to the doctors, and he died on the 21st of December and was buried, at his own long-standing wish, among the war dead of the Third Army in Luxembourg, in a plain grave, in a long row of plain graves. The circumstances of the accident have been argued over ever since, and there is no need to argue them here, because the arguments are mostly noise, and the fact underneath them is plain enough. The man who had said all his life that the proper death for a soldier is the last bullet of the last battle, died on a wet road in peacetime, in a low-speed collision, 3 months after the only war he was built for had finished with him. He left no diary entry for that morning. He had no time. But the 4 words were already written, weeks before, on a sheet in a villa, and they were already enough. I have read that line many times now. It does not get smaller. A man who believed, sincerely, that he had lived before, who stood on the hill at Carthage in 1943 and told his staff he had been there, who wrote a poem about his own deaths in older wars. That man was not, at the end, asking to be remembered. The motto is not about memory. It is about identity surviving destruction. He did not write that he would be remembered. He wrote that he rises again, the same, changed. He was answering Belisarius across 1400 years, and he was answering the boy who had wept over the blind beggar, and he was telling the truth as he understood it. Whether he was right about any of it, no one can say. The geometers say the spiral comes back. The historians say the man does not. Both of them are buried under the same wrong shape and the right words. Eadem mutata resurgo. The same. Changed. I rise again.